once the question's defined, they talk about it for 2 years before they vote. And if it's a serious matter, they'll argue about it for 4 years before they actually do the vote. So that's the kind of time frame you need to do a serious referendum.
So sorry, I just wanted to interrupt you just because it's 7:27 right now by this clock. And originally what our plan was, so we did this democratically of course, was that we would break out into groups of 6 or 8 where we could discuss these issues in more detail amongst ourselves, so it's a bit less formal and less rigorous, but I don't know if we can do 2 groups of about 6 right now. So I don't know if you guys want to switch to that right now, and then we can do like a report back from each of the groups afterwards, or we can continue with the Q&A session as is right now. It's up to you guys.
I'm just going to throw it out there. I think we're a small enough group. This is a fairly open discussion.
Okay.
Yeah, this is pretty
Okay,
cool.
then we'll continue. So we have a question, I think,
What is a citizens' assembly?
Yeah, well, it's a group of ordinary citizens who were given a mandate to consider whether or not we should change the voting system. And this happened in BC, and we had one in Ontario, and they also had one in Holland on the British Columbia model, because this was a revolutionary thing, never been done before. The government actually said, we're going to let the citizens decide, and if they decide, if they recommend a change, there will be a referendum, and if the referendum wins, we'll do what they say. So that much was good, but it turns out it's still sabotage. So these were groups of, as I say, ordinary citizens with no axe to grind and no agenda other than making a better democracy. We're given some time and resources and allowed to do the tough job of figuring out, well, what kind of voting system should we actually use? And both of them, like both of these citizens' assemblies, within about 2 weeks of being formed, they said, well, obviously we need a new voting system, and obviously it has to be a proportional system. So let's discuss the rest of the details. Right?
That does sound remarkable because it sounds it sounds almost like the original Greek, kind of thing by lottery and any ordinary citizen. I've got 2 questions. One is, was there decision making within the assembly consensus based? Do you know anything about how they made decisions? And 2, has something like that, a citizens' assembly, been used for any other policy considerations or referendums other than voting systems?
Both of the citizens' assemblies were really, really well run. In both cases, they chose somebody really good to head it up. In BC, it was a guy who was the former president of Simon Fraser University, I think, and in Ontario, it was George Thompson, who's a judge. He's a guy who teaches judges how to be judged, right? So they were wonderful models of democratic practice, and they gave them a good secretariat to good research staff and that sort of thing. As I say, the process was solid gold right up to the point at which they held a referendum. Once the final report was delivered, everything went in the toilet.
And just, do you know if they've ever been used for something other than...
Something else? There's kind of talk about that. Dalton McGuinty has talked about having citizen juries to discuss other matters, which is something a little less, wonderful, but the same sort of idea. Let's let citizens get together and talk about it with some resources.
Because I'm just thinking about one thing that you mentioned especially in the what did you call it? How do you term it? The majority-driven democracies. Majoritarian. Yeah. The disconnect between the populace and the government. And it sounds like a remarkable system to get, rather than polls, to actually have a group of random citizens be fully educated and then, go, this is actually what, without your provocation, we think,
And they really strove to develop consensus in the citizens' assemblies. And there were scholars flocking around and watching how they did it and what they did, and there's some very interesting studies analyzing how the citizens' assemblies work. Larry wanted to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the British Columbia, that was the first instance anywhere
in the world.
Yeah.
And Ontario was the second
Wow.
in the world, and last in the world up to this point, where government actually deferred to a citizens' body, essentially make equivalent of legislative decision to go directly to the people, make a final decision on whether to change the way we do politics. It was really quite mind-blowing. But we learned all sorts of things. Right? It's a wonderful experience. Gordon Campbell deserves a lot of credit for being the first politician ever to agree to do that. But he equally deserves to be condemned for the way he subsequently sabotaged it. And I think we in the electoral reform movement got blindsided on his snooker a little bit in B.C. because when Gordon Campbell's cabinet found out he was going to honor his campaign promise to turn over to the citizens this decision, his cabinet freaked on the thing because, again, as Wayne said, they just came out of an election where they won all but 2 seats. And the cabinet people looked around the room and realized that during their fair results, half of them wouldn't have jobs in that room. So they decided that 50% plus 1, which is the way every referendum decision federally and provincially in Canada up to that point in history had been made because that's the democratic standard. They decided that wasn't good enough. That we'll create a double supermajority threshold. So it has to be 60% of the popular vote and a majority support 60% of the writings. And they must have just been laughing up their sleeves in this cabinet meeting because that's a standard virtually you can never get in a democracy on any issue. No government would ever be elected if they had to hit that threshold. No politician would be elected if they had to hit that threshold in writing, and so on. So they brought that forward. The reform movement, now with hindsight, we look back on this, the reform movement was saying, well, do we, at this point, say this is sabotaging democracy? At this point, we can't accept this threshold and fight it. Or do you go all the way and say, this is the first time in history we've had the opportunity to change the system. Let's go for it. The decision was made, let's go for it. And unfortunately, got so close that 58% in that first British Columbia election, and 77 of the 79 ridings had majority support for it, and the 2 ridings that did came in at 49%. It's just like, there's not that level of support for anything politically in Canada. And the media to this day refers to, the referendum process. There was a majority, victory. So, and then in Ontario, when the referendum came, again, it looked like he was going to go 50% plus 1. And then right at the last minute, they changed the rules here too. And we had a reform movement went in the same debate, hand-wringing, what do we do? Well, we'll complain about it up to the point the campaign starts and then we'll shut up because it'll sound like we don't have confidence we can win. But, getting back to Wayne's point that you get these processes moving, but there's lots of ways for the government to sabotage it. And you underfund public education, right? Make sure the public really know the issues. There was research done in Ontario after our referendum. We were only about 38% in favor of it. Researchers came in and they studied the people who could actually answer objective questions on how the alternative worked, and then they looked at how they voted and were able to project if all voters actually had a good understanding of how the alternative worked. If the voters had a good understanding, they projected the result would have been reversed.
Wow.
63% in favor, 37 against. So sabotaging public education is another way to stop it.
Yeah, it's a huge job of education. First, to get people to understand that, yes, you're pissed off at politicians. And the reason is because these aren't the guys you voted for. And second of all, to understand that there are alternatives. There are other ways to vote that will make a difference. And while trying to talk to people about anything technical, try to explain that thermostat to people, but the trouble too is that when we're trying to persuade people to make a change is scary. So we have to give them arguments and facts, blah, 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 whereas the opponents only have to try to confuse people, which turns out to be remarkably easy to do.